morning, we're going to talk all about cloisonné, and I had the question that hopefully all of you can answer at the end. How many types of cloisonné are there? When you speak of cloisonné, you're speaking of typically an object that has been decorated with a particular technique as part of enameling. So what is cloisonné? It's one of several recognized methods of fusing glass to a substrate. And I use substrate because it can be fused to a number of different things, including other glass. But usually, and particularly when we're talking about Chinese cloisonné, it's usually metal. And so when you fuse glass to metal, that's how you create enamel. So enamel, and therefore cloisonné, is always vitreous. It's always glass. And the glass used is sometimes referred to as soda lime silicate glass. What that really means is it's breakable. It's not the kind of glass you could put in your oven, for example. It's not like Corningware or some of those things. So cloisonné is a decorative art form that's been practiced since at least 1300 before the Common Era, BCE. So the other enameling techniques that are quite common are Limoge, which is painting, cloisonné, Champleve, Basse, Taille, Grisaille, and Plique Jour. So let's talk about what's not enamel, or at least not for the purposes of this conversation. Enamel paint, enamel nail polish, plastic or resin enamel, tooth enamel, and other non-vitreous uses of the word enamel. What do you need to know about enameling in general? Well, enamel, or ground glass typically, can be opaque, transparent, or opalescent. It's colored with metal oxides, and many of these are poisonous: lead, cadmium, mercury, barium, chromium, cobalt, and magnesium. And it's mixed with other substances such as potash or borax to give it certain characteristics such as hardness, softness, sparkle, elasticity. And this is important because you'll see as we go through the slides, most cloisonné pieces have a base color. That base color has to be the hardest one, because if not, with each firing, the base color would bubble up through the other colors that were placed on top. So it can be applied by spraying, dipping, applied as a paste, a powder, or the glass can be ground so finely that it can become a part of ink or watercolor. For cloisonné, it's used as a paste. So this is a little photograph. Why are all the enameling words French? Well, it's because the city of Limoges in France was once a very, very popular and prolific producer of enamels. And because they were sold all over the world, the French word sort of took over. So what does cloisonné mean? It can mean cell or compartment or partition, as shown in the photograph. Let me get my laser pointer. So you can see that there's a base metal here, but then there are perpendicular wires that have been bent and placed to create a pattern or a picture. So wires are used to divide colors. or sometimes just to create designs. In other words, there may be wires within the same color to create a design. And the wires are applied to the metal substrate or base by either heat or glue. The heat, when it's used, is done in two ways. Sometimes a clear layer of color, or even just clear glass, is placed on the metal. Then the wires are placed on top of that layer, and they melt into the first layer, and that holds them in place. The other way that they can be applied by heat is through soldering. Soldering is a way to adhere one metal to another by using a lower melting temperature combination metal. But that usually contains zinc, and that interferes with the glass. So sometimes if you use solder, you'll get bubbles or irregularities in the surface. So the wires can be thick, thin, straight, twisted. They can be long or short. They can be few or many, as shown in these examples. So these are twisted wires. Here in this Byzantine piece, the wires show the design of the garment, but don't separate colors. And here there are very few wires. These are examples of the other standard enameling techniques that I mentioned. So this is Grisaille. Grisaille you will identify because it always has a black background. So you start with black glass on metal, and then you apply white over and over and over until, and each time it has to be fired until you get the proper coloration. So it's kind of the reverse of watercolor. These two pieces are Champleve. In Champleve, you remove metal from the surface and then fill those depressions with enamel. This piece is painted, so you can grind the enamel, that is, grind the glass so finely that it can be used as if it were a watercolor or like an oil paint. So the glass is in a medium, but the medium that evaporates with the heat. And when I'm talking about heat, the glass is cooked on the metal in a kiln at about 800 degrees centigrade, or about 1450 to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. This piece is an example of Plique Jour, which has little compartments, but it has no substrate. So it has a different name. This is an example of Basse Taille. Basse Taille is typically a single transparent enamel over a decorated metal surface. So you see through the glass to the decoration. And this piece has a combination of the techniques. It has Cloisonné, it has Basse Taille, and it has a little bit of Champleve. So which of these techniques are often confused with Cloisonné? The most common confusion is with Champleve. So you can see here that the metal surface is being removed, or parts of the metal surface are being removed here with a graving tool. It's a type of tool that cuts into the metal and removes pieces of metal. Then when enamel or glass is placed within these depressions, the surface, after it's ground down, will appear as lines, but they're not cloisonné lines, they're Champleve lines. So here you can see in this cross, there are thin lines that one might confuse with cloisonné, but if you look carefully, you can tell that the wires have not been applied. They're not applied wires. That's actually the metal surface. And then the enamel is below the surface. Champleve was a very common style in Europe in the Middle Ages. This is a 19th century Chinese pair of vases that are done in the Champleve style. And without looking at a lot of pieces, it's hard to tell immediately whether what you're seeing as lines are the metal surface with the coloration being below surface, or whether you have a solid surface with lines and colors on top of that. In other words, have wires been added? This is another piece of Plique Jour. Now, often Plique Jour is done putting all of these wires, gluing them often to a metal surface, applying the glass or enamel, and then etching away the metal so that what remains can be seen through. It's a beautiful technique. It's probably the most complicated of all of the enamel techniques, with cloisonné being the second most complicated.
Sherry, excuse me, this is Evelyn. I just wanted to let you know that some people are having trouble in seeing the laser. So when you have multiple photos, if you could explain which one you're talking about, as well as point to it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. This is Basse Taille. So I'm talking about the starfish here. The starfish, as you can see, has striations. These striations are under the surface on the metal, and then there's a clear layer of this sort of yellow-green placed over the striations. So the lines are not added as perpendicular lines to the surface. They are etched in or drawn in or scratched in, and then a transparent color is placed over them. The same is true of the blue piece on the bottom, where there are decorations underneath the layer of transparent blue. And so you can see the surface of the metal and the decorations on that surface. This top piece, the vessel with the lid, is less apparent as Basse Taille, but it is. I wasn't able to blow this up anymore and still have it clear, but there are decorations here on these green leaves. Underneath the glass, the metal has been decorated, usually by a scribe, which is a pointed implement, or by a graver, which is what we saw removing large pieces back a couple of photos. In any event, this piece is Basse Taille.
Sherry, also, I apologize for interrupting again, but there's a question if you could also add the location and time period for when some of these techniques were originated. Thank you.
I don't know if I can do that, Evelyn. I know about cloisonné. Cloisonné has been in use since about 1300, before the Common Era. The other techniques, many of them, I believe, were originated in Limoges, in the city of Limoges in France. but I can't guarantee that that's accurate. Okay, cloisonné, how is it made? You choose your base metal. Most typically it's brass or bronze, copper, silver, or gold. You choose the wires that you can use. You can use brass, copper, silver, or gold, and you choose your enamel colors. And they need to be washed before they're applied. So enamel colors, as I indicated, it's glass that has been colored and it's purchased or prepared. I don't know anybody who actually prepares their own, but it's purchased either in lumps or already ground. When you wash your enamel, you grind it more in a mortar and pestle. And the washing is to remove all of the dust so that when you are applying the enamel, you just have grains that are about equal in size, but not dust, because if you're using transparent, that will make it cloudy. So this is just a simple image to try to show you part of the technique. I'm looking now at number 3. The metal base is here, and these gray parts are supposed to represent the ground glass that has been put on top of the surface and fired, usually repeatedly. Most cloisonné pieces take anywhere from 20 to about 40 different firings, meaning putting in and out of the kiln. And each time the glass contracts. So you get, it's always highest next to the wires because it's adhering to that metal as well as the bottom metal, and then it adheres to the glass underneath it. And you keep filling these cloisons time and time again until the glass reaches the top and exceeds the top of the wires. And after that happens, then it's ground down so that the surface of the wires can be observed. Here's another simple illustration showing you that because glass contracts when it adheres to the metal or adheres to glass underneath it, the contraction will cause warpage. So once fired over and over, unless you put the glass on the other side, in other words, what's called counter enamel, you will have warpage of the underlying metal unless the metal is very thick. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of vessels are so heavy. They're so heavy because they are not counter enameled, or they are counter enameled only a little, not enough to prevent the warpage. So they have to use a very thick metal to start with. So here's just the next 3 or so slides are to show you just in a kind of obvious way how enamel is applied. This is paste in this plastic spoon. This is ground glass mixed with water. And every person who does enameling has their own, what do I want to say, method of how much water they mix in, how pasty they have their enamel. This is a photo of silver. This is probably fine silver, which means it's 99.9% silver. Sterling is 975. So fine silver has more silver to it. and it doesn't react with the glass. These are gold cloisonné wires, and the artist has ground glass on this paintbrush and is applying it to the surface between the wires. This is more application. This is blending. In other words, he's adding different colors along this route so that when he finishes, it will look blended. This is putting it on a firing rack. You can see that not all of the cloisons are filled, and this is typically how it's done and why it requires so many firings. Here's a picture of putting it into the kiln. And then this is a photo after that particular piece has been fired with just that little bit of enamel on it. It's hard to see here how much contraction has occurred with the glass, but it shrinks essentially as it is fired. So you have to do it over and over again to fill up those cloisons. This is just a picture of how he compares the colors that he's getting on the surface to the colors that he wants to get. This is a photograph designed to show you what a piece of cloisonné that's been fired looks like when it's time to start grinding. So you can see here on these wires, I hope you can see that maybe it would be helpful if, let's see, if I change to a pen. Well, okay. So here, these wires, I hope you can see, have glass on top of them. They're not clean, they're not clear here. So that means that you can start the grinding process. And the grinding can be by hand. It's usually called stoning because it used to be done literally with stones. This is a more modern day grinding wheel. These are just some examples of modern day enamels. You can see the blending here and in here, how it's done. Glass, each grain melts, and so it doesn't mix easily. In other words, you can't take red and green and make brown. You can't take red and orange, red and yellow and make orange. You have to use colors, one color blended just barely into another color. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about the distinction between Chinese Cloisonné and Japanese Cloisonné. Chinese Cloisonné dates from the Yuan dynasty, about 12 to 1300 Common Era, and came in, we think, through Yunnan, the Yunnan province, which is down here. And it's uncertain whether the technique was introduced from the Islamic peoples, the Mughal peoples, or from Greece and Turkey. But Chinese craftsmen began to produce cloisonné enameled wares that reached a high standard. And originally, because of the whole concept of gentleman scholar in China, the bright and multiple colors of cloisonné was considered garish and unsuitable for the home of a scholar. But it was prized at court and used primarily for temples and palaces. What are the characteristics of Chinese cloisonné? Usually the glass is opaque. There's a blue color identified with China. that I think we'll see in some of the pieces. Most often, a Chinese cloisonné has a ryori or cloud pattern on the rim and or the base. The enamel is ground down to show the wires, and the wires are often gilded or plated with gold. So once the grinding is done and the perpendicular wires can be observed on the surface, then you can do what's called plating. And I'm sure you're all familiar with, for example, plated silver. You can plate with gold, and it adds a distinct gold color. Even if you're using copper wires or brass wires, it adds gold to the surface. And then gold was often added also to the rim and the base that were metal. In China, the colors and techniques remained traditional. And the wires were often soldered to the base metal, and that creates some defects in the enamel. So sometimes you'll see bubbles, or you'll see a discoloration because the glass doesn't react well to the zinc. So here's a censer, and some of these images, or many of them, are from the San Diego Museum of Art because that's where I'm a docent. So this here is the ryori pattern. Sorry, I don't know how to erase that. This piece does not have a ryori pattern. This piece has the ryori pattern up here, and I believe it's also at the base. This is designed to show you different kinds of ryori patterns. In other words, the shape, if you can see here, is a little distinct. This one has a point to it. And then here on this piece, they really look like clouds. The cloud form is auspicious, and that's why it's applied to these pieces. This little lidded piece, the same pattern is used here, but not as a rim. It's a basic part of the design. This is mid-18th century, and again, it has the pattern up here, if you can see the pencil. And then this is just a close-up to try to show you here this pattern. Not drawing very well, but you can see it here. So just a few more pieces. This is the piece that had the real cloud-like decoration, a close-up of that. Now, this piece, the museum has had in, I'm talking about the San Diego Art Museum, has had in the Cloisonné box for some time, but it's really painted. These are all painted on and then covered with a transparent enamel. And it was felt that this little dish, which is a brush washer, would be appropriate for a scholar's home. So it could be on the desk where calligraphy is done. So this was copper go back here, during a period 1736 to 95, the Qianlong period. And it's just for containing water for use on a brush. So how does Japanese cloisonné differ? Well, I indicated that Chinese cloisonné can be dated to about the 13th century, the Yuan dynasty. But it appears that there was cloisonné in China, just not abundant cloisonné. There was cloisonné in China as early as the 7th century because a piece of Chinese cloisonné was found in Japan and dated to the 7th century of the Common Era. It was a mirror. It appears to be a combination of cloisonné and Champleve. I don't have a photo of it. But it was inspiration after it was found for Japanese artists, and particularly one or two of them, to start doing cloisonné. And when that was started, there were a lot of innovative or non-traditional techniques used in Japan. One of which was the use of large blank spaces with enamel but no wires. The use of the almost exclusive use of transparent enamels and new colors. The decoration of the surface under the transparent enamels. And when that happened, because that's a Basse Taille technique, I honestly don't know. And the use of decorative techniques to add sparkle. So this is a former samurai, Kaji Tsunekichi, and the samurai had, they were paid by the emperor, but it was a pittance. And so many of them had to earn money in other ways. And Kaji Tsunekichi started developing cloisonné. He was helped by the fact that after Japan opened up to the rest of the world in 1868, the German chemist Gottfried Wagner was invited to Japan to work with the Imari porcelain makers in Kyushu. And he was invited in the hopes of using chemistry to develop new colors and techniques for use on porcelain. Once he had worked there for a while, he was then called to Tokyo to work with enamelists. And he created a range of colors and more intense colors and clearer transparents. So that combination led Japan to new techniques. And then the Japanese started displaying these techniques in some of the world art forums that were going on at that time, world fairs and so forth. So what are those techniques? Well, one of them was this raised cloisonné, or moriage, again a French term. This is on opaque enamel, but hopefully you can look at this leaf and see that it wasn't ground down in these areas. It was left to be, to create a surface texture on the surface of the vessel, but done beautifully. That's very hard to achieve, that smoothness after firing and the exact elevations that you want in each space. Another technique was to use wires here, and I'm drawing out into the gray, but the wire would have been at the edge of the white and the wire would have been here. And then after the wires are filled, the wires are removed. So they were never adhered to the surface, either by glue or heat. They were filled and then removed after firing. And that creates this wonderful, delicate line that has no wire. It's called wireless cloisonné. A third technique was to forge wires. So instead of the wires simply being straight up and down, they would be forged on the edge. Forging is a form of hammering and of changing the shape of the wires so that the wires would be thick and thin in different places. And the artist would create the forging to match the design that he or she wanted to create. So this is one Japanese vase dated 1890, and it just shows you the moon here, this cloud, and some of the areas in the flower. So here, across here, are wireless. The rest of these, for example, here, these all have wires, and the branches all have wires. It's just done to soften the image. Another example, part of the flower is done wireless. So I'm hoping you understand wireless doesn't literally mean wireless. It means that there's no wire left at the end. The wire has been removed as part of the process. You can't really see it in this photograph. Let's go here. This is what I was talking about glass doesn't mix. So this is a technique of creating almost a mustard looking effect by using two different colors, but not blending them. Blending them would be going from the dark color here to the light color here by gradation and putting in colors in between those two. So you'd start with the dark and then you'd have a little bit of the next lighter and the next lighter and the next lighter until you get to the light part. That was what we saw in the modern cloisonné that I showed you earlier. This is a technique to create a surface or a look that was wanted. In other words, they did this on purpose. And this is an example of the sparkle. The sparkle is often done by adding mica to the glass, little tiny bits and pieces of mica or other shiny substance that can withstand the heat of 1450 to 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. This is an example of cloisonné on porcelain. So cloisonné on a form of glass. This is an example, I'm sorry, it's a bad picture, of Russian cloisonné where almost all the wires are twisted. So you don't have the same filling above the surface and grinding down as you do in the Chinese and Japanese cloisonné. So a short history of cloisonné. This is a photograph of the earliest known piece of cloisonné. It was discovered in a Mycenaean tomb in Cyprus in 1952. You can see the gold wires here. Hopefully you can see them here. And then the white is what used to be glass. Glass deteriorates over time, but the gold doesn't. This was also found in the tomb, and this area is all cloisonné. This is a piece from Egypt, and it's often referred to as cloisonné, but it's not, it's inlaid. This is where the wires are adhered to the metal surface, but then they're filled with stone. Stones cut to fit the various little places the wire cells or cloisons. This is another piece that is sometimes referred to as having cloisonné, but it appears on close observation that it's like the Egyptian piece, and those are cut stones as opposed to glass. That's from the 4th century BCE in Georgia, used to be part of Russia. This is a 3rd and 2nd century BCE Greek piece, and there is cloisonné in this section here and also on the other side. You can see the little pieces also here. This is another example of cut stones to fit as opposed to glass. This is interesting. This is a Byzantine piece. And in the Byzantine piece, what happened was a big circle would be either cut out or cast. It would be cast in that way. And then within that circle, wires would be placed and colors would be put in and fired. The same is true down here. So the piece starts as a circle with 2 deep depressions. And then within the depressions, there are wires and colored glass placed. The same is true here. And this is an example, I think I showed you before, where the cloisonne wires are used often decoratively without separating colors. The same example of Champleve. This is cloisonné done together with other metal work on the surface. There's a lot of work done like this in Russia and in India. This is a piece of Belle Epoque French jewelry, and you can see the moriage raised surface here of the enamel. So vessels today are typically spun on a lathe of some sort, but they used to be hand raised. That means you start with a flat sheet and you hit the metal in such a way that you cause it to contract. And you start at the bottom and you cause it to come up. You start down here at the bottom and you hit and hit and hit. It's a very laborious technique until the vessel is raised to the shape that you want it. Then the wires are applied. This looks as if there's a stick with another branch out here where the vessel can be placed at the proper level for the application of wires. These wires were glued on. And the glue is a glue that will melt and not leave a residue. Here the cloisons are filled. And this is a kiln. In this type of kiln, the vessels were loaded in downward. In other words, the other kiln I showed you was more like an oven that we use today. You heat it up and put the cloisonné piece in flat, or if it were a vessel, you would stand it up and put it in. In this particular photograph, the vessel is lowered into this kiln. Then this is the hand stoning. There are stones, or were until some fires occurred, there were stones from some places, I believe in Ireland, that were notorious for their very fine finish. And so literally stones were used to ground down the glass. Today, it's usually sandpaper or the machinery, as I showed you earlier. Once the grinding is done, then it's polished, and the polishing occurs just with a finer and finer grit of stone or sandpaper or whatever is available, sometimes sand itself. And these are just some images of cloisonné today. In other words, here's a vessel with cloisonné on the exterior. These are cups. This is a brooch. And this is another vessel. And you can see, in large part, because covering the entire vessel with wires is so laborious that oftentimes modern day cloisonné artists will only use a few wires, but it's still considered a form of cloisonné. And with that, Evelyn, I'm finished.
Sherry, that was absolutely a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Your photographs, your explanation of how the process is done has certainly helped educate all of us to appreciate some of this finer art form that we may not have been familiar with. I'm sure there's going to be some questions, but for now, we're going to hold those until the end. We're going to hear a short presentation from Andy Liu, who is so willing to share with us his private collection of cloisonné pieces, as well as some others. So let me tell you a little bit about Andy before we get going. And please write down your questions so you remember them for Sherry later. But first, let me tell you about Andy. He is a longtime resident of Rancho Santa Fe, and he is an avid collector of Chinese antiques and artifacts. He has a very strong interest in Chinese history and culture, and has conducted a lot of research in the art history of China, and he is well versed in all of these subjects as well as antiques. So let me have the honor of welcoming Andy to our virtual stage. Andy?
Thank you, Evelyn. And Sherry give us a very, very clear picture how to make the cloisonné and how difficulty to make these kinds of art. Let me introduce how this thing is coming from China. Sometimes a historian make mistakes because in our history, always talk about the Yuan dynasty, they are all warriors. You know, they like fight, you know, they got the 3 times go to Europe. Actually, they bring back the cobalt blue and also the Cloisonné. And after these two things come into the China, the bigger melting pot, they become big, especially the cobalt blue. We always think that cobalt blue is a Ming dynasty. Actually, it's from Yuan dynasty. As you know, the cobalt blue porcelain so popular. The whole world like it. Not only China. That's why the Neuric Zhenghe in Ming Dynasty going to we call it, you know, the Silk Road on the ocean, going to the Europe and the Middle East. Everybody like these things. So finally, they give this old mystery Oriental country called China. And our history didn't know these things come from Yuan. About 50, 60 years ago, you know, in British Museum have a Davis Foundation. He collect the Chinese porcelain is the best of the best. And they have two vases. It's elephant hair handle. And on these two vases, very clear, very clear. He wrote the Yuan Dynasty, 大正 time. Mr. Zhang Wenjing made these two vases to the Buddha's temple, ask Buddhas bless their families. So one gentleman in the Davis Foundation wrote an essay, an article on the British Museum's magazine and also some other magazine. They say cobalt blue is coming from Yuan Dynasty, much earlier, about 100 years earlier in the Ming Dynasty. So the Chinese scholars go back the Forbidden City and find out pick out all the pieces they own, they find out it's true. Yuan Dynasty cobalt blue is different Ming Dynasty. And also they used the Cloisonné. They got about 4,000 plus Cloisonné. They made a comparison with the porcelain. They said, oh yeah, this shape almost 90% same. So this one should be in the Yuan Dynasty coming to China. Actually, because Yuan Dynasty, they don't dating very few pieces. There's only these two pieces they got date on it. So they only use a comparison. But early Ming Dynasty, they do have make a teapot to the Tibet, the beautiful teapot. You know, the Tibet people, they have a custom. They like the milk tea, you know. I don't know if you taste or not. You have to get used to it, taste it. And you go to the Brother Palace in Lhasa, still there. This is a Yongluo dynasty give to them as a gift, you know, and a very beautiful. They call the monk's head. We call the 真履帽, you know, that type of a pot, teapot, really beautiful. But we name this one the Jingtai. Jingtai line, the Jingtai dynasty. Jingtai only have a 7 years period. So this is another story. How come it's so short? Well, we named this one called the Jingtai line. And now let me share my collection with you people. Okay, the first one. Usually, the Cloisonné in China, most are all blue. But my collection is white because their subject is gold. There's 3 heads gold. And those white things only got another one is a crane. The big crane in the Forbidden City in the palace. You can see it, they got each side have 2. That's white also. And why they pick up this topic is very interesting. This topic in Chinese we call the San Yang Kai Tai. This slang is coming from the Yi Jing. You know the Yi Jing, we talk about the yin yang, these kind of things, the gua, all the kind of very complicated book. And this book is coming around the Zhou dynasty. That's about 2,600 years ago. So this is slang there called San Yang Kai Tai. What that means? That means is winter is gone. The rough winter is gone. Springtime is coming. The warm and beautiful time is coming. So always we think is lucky, for what they call San Yang Kai Tai. Actually, the Yang equivalent, another Xiang, in old times you can equivalent use it. The Xiang means good luck. So that's why always you say the Yang is a very lucky animal, in the 12 zodiac. And then we'll go to the next one. Okay, this is a detail of my collections. You can see the carving and you get the inlay. You can see the lotus, continuation lotus. And also, in our school, when we were in the elementary school, teacher always tell us, hey, you should watch the lamb, when the baby lamb take the milk for the mother, they always kneel down. This is a nature phenomenon. But in ours, like teaching class, teaching course, say, hey, you guys grow up. You better be good to your parents, especially your mother. You have to do better than the animals. This is why we use this yang. It's always is good stuff. And also, the enamel coming to China is a big thing because in China we don't have the enamel before. So when the Kangxi time, they develop more enamel because when they coming from the west, it's very expensive and a long way coming, and not too many colors you can pick. And it's so beautiful. The emperor very very like it, and so Kangxi time he develop much more colors. So after Qing dynasty, they develop use this enamel not only for the cloisonné, also they apply on the copper, also apply on the porcelain, also apply to the glass. Apply the glass is a very, very difficulty because glass, the melting point, almost the same. So sometimes you achieve the enamel, but the glass is going to start change the shape. And also in the Republic time, we use lots of the enamel on the metal, like a cup, like a washbowl, very popular, at least for 20, 30 years, because the metal is not copper, it's cheaper metal, and it avoid rusty, and also it's beautiful, and also it's very easy to clean. It's very popular in our time. Okay, let's go next. Okay, this one is just I talk about enamel on copper. And this is garden seed. Actually, you got the 9 dragons around these garden seeds. And top is a dragon. But unfortunately, the top is damaged. It's scratched. And I bought this one about 20 some years ago in La Jolla antique shop. The owner tried to close down and move back to East Coast with their family, with his family. So I picked up a couple of snub bottle, and so I asked him, what happened to this seed? This seed is so beautiful. And what happened on the top, You know what he say? Hey, somebody think this is a gold. Some idiots think this is a gold and they scratch the top. So I said, okay, since then you give me a deal. So he sold me like a copper. He said, okay, what's the copper price today? I sold you as a copper. So I bought these things almost like, very, very reasonable price, but it's real, real nice because it's night dragon stuff. One subject, very, very rare because this is the only emperor can use. You know the emperor sit in the sea? That's a night dragon. We call it Jour. That's the only emperor can sell on. And let's see the next one. See this top of the garden seat. See, this is a motif. This is coming from the bronze. That means it's a little dragon. And you can see the middle have a Qian. This seed is coming from Qianlong Nianzi, in Qianlong time. And let's go to the next. Okay, this is my another collection. This is enamel on porcelain. And this one is gourd shape because the Chinese in that time heavily believe the religion is a Tao. So this thing they say is have some kinds, the medicine in there you can eat, can longevity, So in other words, the Chinese think this is a longevity, symbol longevity. And this is used enamel painting on this porcelain. So you can see they're pretty good, pretty pretty. And also, I want to mention is when the Kangxi time, they really know how to use the enamel. They can control the enamel very, very well. So they don't need to use a wire, use something else, and they can control it. They don't let the color mix. And we can see next one is the detail. It is a detail of the thing, the mountain thing. So you can see it, they're very clear. The lines are very straight. Okay, let's see next. Next one, I want to show a couple pieces, and it's not my collection, but they're very famous. One is that's an enamel on glass. This piece originally found in Massachusetts. So it's a Taiwanese collector, and Mr. Mr. Cao Xinchen, he bought this piece in the Massachusetts auction. And in the 2019, he resell these things in the Sotheby's in Hong Kong. And so they sold this piece for $207 million Hong Kong dollars. And this is the only one show on the market, on the auction house. So for my understanding, this is only less than 20%, 20 of them, only 20 pieces exist. Most of them in the museum, in the Gugong Museum in Beijing and the Gubong Museum in Taiwan. And only few pieces in the private collectors. Okay, my final one, I will show you this Cloisonné. Cloisonné still very, very popular today in China. This one is China give to the United Nations for the celebrate United Nations doing a good job for 70 years to keep the war peace. So this piece have 7 dots on it. That means 70 years. And this was given to the United Nations on the September 27, 2015. And this one is a very beautiful piece. In other words, this one is representing the Cloisonné still booming in China, and they're still doing this beautiful, complicated art. And thank you very much.
Thank you so